Dr. Kimmie Weeks is a survivor of the Liberian Civil War who has worked to alleviate poverty and human suffering in Africa and around the world since he was 14 years old. He founded the Hope Farm, a 10-acre organic and sustainable agriculture oasis and training center in Liberia, to train young people, create community seed and tool banks, and organize sustainably grown food cooperatives. For this program and for Liberia, he has hope.
Executive Director of Youth Action International, Director of Africa Operations for Integrum Scientific, and member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council. Dr. Kimmie Weeks, you have a lot of projects that you are dedicated to. One in particular is the Hope Farm.
Yes.
So more than part of your work, you feel that's part of your destiny. Would you mind to please share the story of your childhood, Kimmie, and how it has shaped you and your work?
Thank you so much for having me on your show, and I extend greetings to everybody who's watching and listening to this. Greetings from Liberia, West Africa. The Hope Farm really is a 360 on my life. The reason being, obviously, with the farm, the goal is to grow and provide food in abundance for Liberia and do it in a sustainable way. And the idea of providing food, actually, if you go back in my life, there was a period in my own life as a child when I nearly died from starvation. And this was during the Liberian Civil War. Just to give you a quick bit of history, Liberia is a small country on the west coast of Africa. It was founded in 1847, or received its independence in 1847, and was formed by freed slaves who had left the United States after getting their freedom and had come to Africa. And the place that they settled was essentially what is now Liberia. So there is that historical tie between Liberia and the United States. In 1990, or 1989, December 1989 to be precise, the Liberian Civil War began and was led by a man named Charles Taylor, who said he was coming to lead a grand revolution. I was 9 at that point, so obviously I didn't understand the politics, but hey, when the war was coming, they shut down the schools. So I was like, yeah, thumbs up. Compulsory no school as a 9-year-old. But obviously as stuff was coming, the reality started to sink as everything else closed down. Liberia at that point was one of the fastest developing African countries. There were people from all over Africa who used to come to Liberia for school, for work, for opportunities. But then as the war was coming, everything started to shut down. Hospitals, clinics, supermarkets, everything that you could think about that made life normal. Eventually, as the fighting and the was going on, you had the situation where where even the national electric supply and the water supply were all destroyed. At a certain point, my mom and I were forced to leave our homes, and we went to a refugee camp with thousands of other people. And it was in this midst of the camp, surrounded by all of this chaos and all of this war, in a classroom built for, maybe 30 students that now had 25 plus extended families laying on the ground because there was nowhere else to go. And people were essentially surrounded by, the pains and the suffering. And that's when I started to experience hunger and starvation and being sick without having access to medication. And after being sick for a long time, or for several days, I had stopped responding, stopped getting up. And basically at that point, I was declared dead. And my body was taken out and thrown in a heap of dead bodies and left for dead. So when my mom essentially found me and revived me, I knew that I wanted to spend the rest of my life working for change. I didn't know how, I didn't know what I would do. I was only 10 at that point, 9 going on 10. But essentially I said to myself, or I said a prayer that if I survived the war, that would become my life's work and focus. And that led to basically day after day working on efforts to make a change in the world.
Wow. Wow. What an incredible, incredible story.
It's been a journey.
I'm still just processing your story, your beginnings, and
I had to do it in a quick fashion because I don't know how long we have, but you know, I mean, it was a journey, and you know, very unexpected because, like I said, we grew up again. Liberia is one of the fastest developing African countries. Nobody thought that war would happen. You know, I remember growing up, and the closest I came to human suffering was seeing on television at that point in the mid 80s was when the famine was happening in Ethiopia in East Africa. Mm-hmm. And I remember seeing on the news the starving children with their bloated bellies, malnourished. And I always used to ask my mom, how is it possible that there were children somewhere in the world who are going, you know, without food? And of course, my mom used to say at that point, hey, that's more reason to eat all your food. But never did she imagine that one day we would be in that exact circumstance. I mean, my mom had gone to the school in New York. She went to the Fashion Institute of Technology, graduated, and came back to Liberia. So I don't think it ever crossed her mind that one day she would be in a war with her child, facing starvation and disease and not being able to do anything about it, and watching her last child essentially die from starvation. And you know, I know that in the moments when I was, or the hours that had been declared dead, was probably the most painful time for her, having to go through that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And here you are with us, smiling and speaking today to tell this incredible story of yours. And to think that that's just the beginning of your incredible, incredible story. You know, so the Hope Farm, right? Supplies more than food. People think farm, food, but it's more than that. I would love for you to tell us about the jobs and the training that your program is providing to Liberian youth.
Well, so just to put in a little bit of context, since the war ended in the early 2000s, Liberia has gone through you know, coming out of war is never easy, and it's been challenging for Liberia. If you can think about it for a moment, during the Liberian Civil War, for example, there were 20,000 children who fought as soldiers. The youngest person was 6 years old, who was forced to hold a gun and was made to kill people on battlefields. So if you think about when the war ended and those children and young people who went through that war, even if you were 10 when the war started, by the time the war ended, you're probably like 26 or so, which means basically your entire life has not been to go to school or have an education or learn or play. It's just been about fighting and killing. And so at 26 now, you have this whole generation of young people who have no means of earning an income, no education, no skills. What happens to them? And there's so many of them now that they're now referred to in Liberia as Zogos, which are essentially the less fortunate or war-affected young people who, by the way, are now having kids of their own, still also with no opportunities. We also now are in a country where Liberia's annual budget at this point is around $750 million, which is very, very small. I think most small US states have more of a budget than we as a country have. But we're importing almost everything we eat. So our staple food is rice. We're spending $250 million a year just to import rice, We're spending another 50 to 60 million just to import eggs and poultry products, 100 million just to import fish. And mind you, we're importing all of this food despite the fact that God has blessed us with amazing climate and weather to grow food in abundance. The few farmers who have been growing food in the past have been heavily dependent on fertilizers, that damage the environment, unsafe or unsustainable agriculture practices that are contributing to global warming. And number two, most young people see farming and agriculture as something you do not do unless you want to die in poverty. Liberia is just the thing that nobody of any stature is supposed to do. And when I looked at the fact that when we have so many young people who are unemployed, no source of income, no formal or informal education or skills, when you look at the fact that we're importing hundreds of $millions of food when we could grow food, I said, wow, this is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to bring hope for thousands of young people. By me, myself, I was blessed after leaving Liberia to go to the United States in exile. And I had the blessing to go to the best schools in America, Amherst College, the University of Pennsylvania, and get the best education, but to come back to Liberia. And basically I said, well, I'm gonna be the example that you don't have to be a poor person or destined for poverty to do agriculture. We're gonna make agriculture cool again. And so despite all my background and travels around the world, I started doing agriculture and doing it not as a boss, but actually being there and putting my hands in the ground and working the soil as an example for young people that, hey, you can do this and there's nothing to be ashamed of in doing agriculture, but also now doing it in a sustainable way. So promoting organic agriculture in Liberia. I met the Minister of Agriculture a few weeks ago, and she said, Kimmie, there's probably only 2 other people who I know who are doing organic agriculture in Liberia, and she wasn't even sure if they were still doing it. And organic agriculture for commercial purposes. So it's something that's brand new. When we started teaching the villagers, about compost and utilization of compost, etc. Pretty much it was so new, and people were like, because I came and I said, we're going to grow food without using fertilizer. And at first people thought I had gone crazy until we started to do it. And then people started to see and said, wow, we can do this. And the reason that it's important to teach people or to show people how to grow food without being dependent on fertilizer is because in Africa is very, very expensive. The average farmer, for example, the average smallholder farmer is living on about $30 a month. A bag of fertilizer is between $60 to $70 for a bag. And for a farmer who's got $30 for an entire month, you're thinking, how am I going to get $70 to buy this inorganic fertilizer? So many farmers simply cannot farm adequately because they cannot afford it. And the message we're sending them, do not waste that $70. Let's do organic farming because you don't have to buy those expensive inputs. You will grow food in abundance. And on top of that, you're saving the environment. So it's a message that's really driving.
Yeah, and I love that, how you're showing, leading by example, and that it is sustainable on so many different levels, economically, environmentally, what you're proposing, this work. I can think of no better name for your program than the Hope Farm.
That's
because I mean, beyond food and training, it does give people hope. So the people of Liberia, giving them this hope, what is it that gives you hope, Kimmie, for the future of your program and for the future of Liberia?
Well, 2 things. Number one, and the first one comes from an experience being in the United States, because being in Liberia in the war, I had this feeling that people around the world did not care that were suffering and dying during the Liberian War. But when I went to the US, I was meeting friends in high school and colleges who had never heard of the war, the brutality of the war in Liberia, and were not aware of it, or weren't aware of a lot of the suffering and pain that's going across Africa. And then I also was seeing how, if people knew and were aware how willing Americans were to reach out and help. And I said, well, that gives me so much hope, because I really felt, especially again, being a child at 10 years old and dying and having this feeling that the entire world, know that people are dying and wasn't doing anything, was very painful. But having that experience of the US and meeting people who really cared and were looking for ways to be involved. And that really was why Youth Action started. It started as a way to now give young people in America the chance to connect and make an impact across Africa. So knowing that there's tremendous heart and willingness to give, and a want to give, and a want to transform the world in a positive way is the first thing that gives me hope. The second thing that gives me hope is just the resilience I see of Africa and Africans and Liberians as a whole, where, despite people going through just extreme circumstances right now, families not having food to feed their kids tomorrow, or not knowing how they're going to get their kids into school, but yet having hope that a better day is possible, and that, hey, we just have to live to see the next day, and the next day will be a good day. And even if that day isn't a good day, living for the next day, and that resilience and hope tells me that when you combine those two things, bringing people who want to help with people who have so much hope and resilience but just need a little push, that tells me with very, very little, you can make a dynamic change, not just in Liberia, but possibly across the entire continent of Africa and the entire world.
Wow, and that's really powerful how you said it that way. When you bring help and hope, and you have these two together, all the possibilities that can be found there. That's
Absolutely
incredible. That's incredible.
Absolutely.
So working to alleviate poverty and human suffering in Africa and all around the world, since at such a young age, you've done so much to help so many. What help is it that you now need? Specifically, let's talk about the Hope Farm. What help do you need?
Well, we're reaching out to people right now to help to support the farm, especially in terms of our water system. Because in Liberia is divided into 2 seasons. There's a rainy season where there's 6 months, like now, 6 months of rain, and then we get 6 months of dry. And one of the difficulties for farmers in Liberia is the ability to grow food all year round. In order to obviously feed a nation, you must have the ability to grow food all year round. And so what we've been looking at, working with Jack Rose and John Rose at Waves for Water, have helped us to get our first hand pump in the farm that's now supplying the entire communities. But we now need to have a system that is more than just a hand pump for drinking water, but to be able to supply water for the crops. And doing it in a simple way that we would be able to replicate that water system in other places. So what the hope is getting support for the water system, also getting hope for our facilitators. Right now we have facilitators who are training people at the farm from villages, young people from the nearby villages. The goal is to get this farm throughout the county and have at least one demonstration farm in each county, because Liberia is divided into 15 counties. So that's 15 small farms that can be teaching opportunities. So people coming in to start, help us start farm in one of these counties to grow these training, because our goal is that within 5 to 10 years, a majority of Liberians have been trained in organic farming methods, and it's just across the country providing food in abundance. So that's the two things we need: help with our water supply, help with getting our resources to set up small farms in each of Liberia's 15 counties.
And it seems like it's so doable. Yes,
it is very doable. It's very doable. For the water system and the current farm, our goal is to raise $10,000 for each additional farm, which would be smaller farms. We're looking to raise $5,000 per farm. But then when you think about the impact that would have across the country, is significant. So it's a small amount of money to have a very, very massive impact in Liberia.
Yeah, and I think the way you're describing it, it's so smart in that creating this sustainable system here, but the way that it's designed, it is designed to scale, across the whole, everywhere.
Across the entire country and eventually the entire continent, because the vision is not just about making the difference in Liberia, it's about across Africa. For example, you have the situation where most of Africa is unable to feed itself, and we're feeling the brunt of that, like most of the other world, as Ukraine goes through the current situation, because a bulk of the corn that comes into Africa is actually coming from Ukraine. The corn, the green is coming from Ukraine. And it does not make sense that a continent like Africa that has the resources, that has the arable land, is depending on grain to come from outside. And that has to change. And this is how we can begin to start to do that.
Right. So over the years, you've had many wins that you've fought really hard for. Which win of all that you've had, which win has meant the most to you?
Well, that's a very tough question. There's many times it's the simple things that really matters to me. Since we've started this work, we've now reached out and impacted well over 300,000 people in 6 post-war African countries. We've opened schools, we've done clinics, we've done health centers, we've done vocational training centers. But honestly, the moments that I cherish is sometimes when I meet individuals who I don't even remember, who come up to me and say, "You don't know me, but I benefited from such and such project years ago." And there's one story, well, 2 stories. One is Uganda, where I was going to visit our projects in Uganda, and I was met on the airport by a young woman, a young girl who was maybe about 10, and she was presenting me a bouquet of flowers. And it was explained to me that her family, they had all been in the streets. There were 6 children. They had all been living off the streets with their mother, and their father had died from HIV. They had been living in the streets, but through the organization, they had received a small grant, or micro grant of $200, and they had started that flower business. And 5 years later, that family now had a place to stay. The kids were in school, and that was one of the daughters who were presenting me a bouquet of flowers from that business. Now, pretty much, if I did nothing else in my life, just knowing that one family's life was impacted is the most rewarding. There's also another story of a young woman. I was traveling to Ghana, and this woman came up to me beautifully dressed. And she said, "Mr. Weeks, you don't know me, but I was one of the women who attended one of the vocational training schools. We run centers for women empowerment that every year 300 women go through and are trained in various skills." And she said, "I was in this center about 10 years ago doing cosmetology. And when I graduated, I started this small salon. And I've grown it that now it's so big that I even go to Ghana for products. I leave Liberia." And this was a woman who had no resources before this and was living a life of commercial sex life to feed herself. And she was like, I'm now leaving and flying on a plane with you to go and get more goods. And again, that's just another story that moves me. So yes, we've done a lot with the projects, but it's those individual stories that keeps me going and keeps me driven, even in the tough times and the challenges when we face them.
Wow, that is so, so beautiful. So for those who are working to create positive social change, who feel that they've not found a win yet, what words of advice would you have for these people?
Oh, yeah. Well, even I go through that. I mean, I go through that every day because I feel like I have not quite done what I'm meant to do yet. It gets very frustrating even for me with all that we've done. I mean, it gets frustrating because sometimes I'm like, oh boy, this is getting so slow, or many days it's like, I wish we had some more resources, because with the organization, it sometimes appears as if we're a multi-million-dollar organization because we're able to really stretch every dollar to create major impact. But many days I'm like, oh boy, I wish we had more funding. I wish we had grants, to do more work, because sometimes I see, millions of dollars in grants, and it's like, darn, we can't even get one of those. And it gets frustrating. So I understand the frustration, but what carries me through every day is really honestly allowing myself to be okay that there's still life ahead. And as long as there's life in the body, that means your purpose hasn't been achieved yet. And as much as I would like to rush to solve all of the problems, I know that it's a purpose, because as the purpose that I'm meant to do is being achieved, I'm also growing. And as I grow, then I know that I'll be able to do more in terms of my purpose. So sometimes I have to check myself and say it's a journey, and as long as you're alive, that means you still have a purpose. So every day I wake up and I say I'm thankful for another day, and I know maybe it's going to be a tough day, but like everybody in Liberia, I say thank God I woke up. That means I still have a purpose, and even if what I do impacts one person, I've made a difference and I've come closer to my purpose. So that's what I would say to people out there who may not see the big wins. I think sometimes in terms of wins, we think about the big stuff that maybe everybody would hail and will be on the cover of newspapers and magazines, or whatever the big goal that we want to attain. But I think we have to focus and be content with knowing that sometimes it's the individual impact that matters. And sometimes the people we impact the most are people we probably will never meet.
Yeah. How powerful. Wow. I'm still, as long as there's still life in the body, there's still a purpose there. Thank you so much for sharing your story, your personal story, the story of your work. Thank you so much for helping all of us just become a bit more aware now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for running the show, and please keep it up. It was a pleasure